Okay, I wanted to talk about Kohut and Kernberg and a little bit about Lacan tonight. Um, I guess I'd like to start just by talking about narcissism, because I think all of these thinkers are concerned with the problem of narcissism. They're all theorists of narcissism. I want to back up a bit first and talk about how I think Freud had an opportunity to theorize narcissism, or to make narcissism more central to his own thinking. I think he kind of had the solution, but he let it slip away from him. I've referred many times to his wonderful 1914 paper on narcissism, where he distinguishes between narcissism and object love, and he makes it very clear that in order to not fall ill, we must learn to love, and must fall ill if we can't love. I think he was very uncomfortable with that statement, because that puts him in the zone of the Abrahamic religions, all of which make the turning to love central. And Freud hated religion. He was a proud Jew, but he hated Judaism. He hated the father, who was praying all the time instead of earning a living for the family. Hated Christianity for good reasons. He was a victim of anti-Semitism. A famous story of his father, the father told him the story of when the father was a young man. He was walking down the street with his new fur cap, and anti-Semites knocked off his cap into the muck. And Freud says, "And Father, what did you do?" And Father said, "I went into the street and picked up my hat and went my way," which Freud felt was a cowardly kind of thing to do. And then later he idealized Hannibal, who he thought of as a Semite who had conquered Rome, the center of Christianity. Freud was so conflicted about Rome, he couldn't go there. He loved antiquities. He wanted to go to Rome, but he'd missed the train because he was going to the center of the enemy. His career as a professor of physiology was blocked due to anti-Semitism. So he had lots of reasons to hate Christianity. And so, that statement, "we must learn to love or we will fall ill," he drops that kind of talk as much as possible and replaces it with a language of mental health. We must move from illness to health, not from narcissism to love. Okay? It's the same move. It's just being cloaked in medical language. But it's the same move from narcissism to love. And he describes narcissistic forms of loving. The object stands for the self I was, or the self that I am, or the self that I want to be. This is not object love. This is narcissistic love. It's a hall of mirrors. I don't even see the other person I think I'm in love with. I'm seeing myself reflected back to me. So Freud could have built psychoanalysis around the overcoming of narcissism, but he doesn't. He opts to go in other directions, and instead of seeing the central human problem as being encapsulated in ourselves, being immersed in ourselves and struggling to get out of self-enclosure, instead of seeing that as the problem. Of course, Christianity sees that as the problem. I mean, the central fundamental sin in Christianity is the sin of pride. All other sins follow from the sin of pride. Freud could have made psychoanalysis focused on the problem of how to get over ourselves, how to get beyond ourselves. But instead he sees the human problem as a human superego and ego attached to an animal id. He sees it as a human mind forever conflicting with an animal body. conceives the problem as a mind-body problem. Notice, now, Jacques Lacan, okay, I mean, he identifies himself as returning to Freud. Well, he doesn't return to Freud. He returns to Lacan and calls Lacan Freud. Okay, he's radically un-Freudian in a certain sense. The fundamental thing you have to know about Jacques Lacan is that he was a Roman Catholic. And Lacanism is Roman Catholicism filtered through the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, which Lacan often doesn't say very much about because Sartre was the previous hero of Paris. You know, I mean, Harold Bloom wrote a whole book about the anxiety of influence, how the new poet needs to escape the power of the previously dominant poet. And in Paris in the 50s and the 60s, the dominant poet was Jean-Paul Sartre. And then, so Lacan has to kill Sartre, bump him off the log. So he doesn't mention Sartre very much, but you know, if you really want to understand Lacan, you've got to understand Catholicism. You have to understand Sartre. So Lacan's brother was a Benedictine monk. And when Lacan died, he had the full rights of the Roman Catholic Church. And he dedicated his PhD thesis to his brother, my brother in religion, he refers to him in dedicating the book. One of Lacan's last books is called Catholicism. And in this book, he says that Catholicism is the one true religion, and the world will come to recognize this. It's only a matter of time, he says. I don't agree with him about Roman Catholicism, by the way, but that was his view. I mean, this shouldn't be a secret to anyone. A guy makes one of his central concepts in the name of the Father. He just left out the Son and the Holy Ghost, but Lacan says psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic cure, means helping the patient come to acceptance of castration, which means that psychopathology is the refusal to accept castration. Okay? I think you just need to replace the word castration with crucifixion, and you understand where Lacan's coming from. The refusal of crucifixion, refusal of castration, which is what the ego is for Lacan. The ego for Lacan is not Freud's ego of id, ego, superego. Okay, so we're talking about acceptance of castration. What does he mean by castration? He means the recognition that this image of myself, which is narcissism, I guess we need to back up and talk about the mirror phase.
Let them know you're talking about Lacan.
I'm talking about Lacan now. So the mirror phase. By the way, the Lacan I'm talking about is only the early Lacan. There are 3 Lacans, early, middle, and late. And I struggled to know a good deal about the early Lacan, and then I lost interest because I just really found it of limited clinical use. I still find Lacanian theory coming to mind when I sit down to analyze a film or a play. But when I'm sitting with people, I find it a very limited clinical usefulness. So I kind of know the early Lacan, and that's all I'm talking about here. This is the Lacan of the mirror phase. So Freud bought into that biological theory called postnatal fetalization, or it's the theory of prematurity. This is a biological theory, which is that the human infant is radically helpless because it is essentially instinctless. That is, it doesn't come into the world pre-programmed the way other animals do. I mean, newborns of other species are far more capable from day one than the human infant is. I mean, the skull hasn't even come together. The fontanelles haven't integrated. You have to hold the baby's head. It's all over the place.
Helpless.
Yeah, they're talking about the fontanelles and stuff.
I'm talking about the helplessness of the newborn, because basically the theory of prematurity is that natural selection was selecting for intelligence, which meant a larger and larger brain, which meant a larger head. And it was difficult enough to get this head through the birth passage anyway. So the solution that nature opted for was to push the baby out before it was done, to push the baby out before it was fully baked. And so a whole lot of development that would ordinarily have taken place in the womb is taking place outside the womb. Now, Freud accepted this theory of prematurity, or sometimes it's called the theory of neoteny, or postnatal fetalization, meaning that the baby is still a fetus for some weeks, maybe months after birth. And so there's this radical helplessness. And Lacan's concept for this is le corps morcelé, the body in bits and pieces. And his idea is that the infant experiences a kind of a massive fragmentation, incoherence, fragmentation, until one day it glimpses an image of itself in the mirror. And he doesn't just mean the literal mirror, he also means the mirror of the mother's eyes. And he falls in love, he becomes fascinated with the image of wholeness, because it feels like a rescue from this state of chaos and fragmentation that it feels itself to be in. And it identifies with the image in the mirror. And of course, for Lacan, this is a misidentification, because the infant is saying that image is me. He's mistaking himself for an image. Now already we're into Catholicism or Judaism, because thou shalt not worship graven images, saith the Lord. This is idolatry. This is why the Jews are so iconoclastic that you can't even print the word God. You got to print G-D. You can't have images. We're not supposed to worship images, but Lacan says we all begin as idolaters. We idolize our self-images. And we place ourselves at the center. And then we feel rivalry with anyone else who would seem to want to usurp our position as the center. And acceptance of castration means breaking with this idolatry, means ceasing to be an idolater. It means accepting a certain inherent lack, loss, incompleteness, imperfection, flawed, brokenness. Jean Vanier wrote a wonderful book called The Broken Body. I mean, Christianity is about man's brokenness, our brokenness. Even after 30 years of psychoanalysis, we still remain fallen, broken, imperfect. Okay, mental health now becomes being able to accept this brokenness, being able to live with lack. Here again, Sartre is coming in. Le néant, nothingness. Sartre's book, Being in Nothingness. So Lacan is saying those who cannot accept lack and castration, and who continue to struggle to represent themselves as whole, are crazy. And this is psychopathology. This is narcissism. And narcissism is not some specialized type of psychopathology for Lacan. Narcissism is psychopathology. Psychopathology is narcissism. And the solution is the overcoming of narcissism through this very humbling process and painful process of acceptance of lack, acceptance of castration. Freud could have gone that way. there's a sense in which going in this way, Lacan is being Freudian. He's picking up on the Freud that Freud never developed fully. Freud went in another direction. But this is there in Freud. He just didn't choose to develop it fully. But Lacan does develop it fully. I find this to be a very valuable contribution of Lacan. What's another contribution of Lacan? Once you've read Lacan, you never read Freud the same way ever again. Because Lacan understands Freud totally metaphorically. Freud, unfortunately, fell into literalism at various places. For example, penis envy. Men can't have penis envy, says Freud. Why? Because we already have a penis. Why would we? And women can't have castration anxiety. Why would they fear losing what they didn't have in the first place? Freud actually says this. Whereas, in fact, anyone who does any kind of psychotherapeutic work knows that men are filled with penis envy. And women are full of castration anxiety. All you have to do is understand that you're talking not about the penis, that literal piece of flesh, but the phallus, which is Lacan's concept. And the phallus is that which enables me to attract the desire of the other. Now here again, Lacan is writing about narcissism. He narcissizes desire. My desire is not to get my rocks off. My desire is to be desired by you. All right? And my phallus is that which I have that makes you desire me, makes me desirable to you. And if it looks like I'm losing, my phallus is my language. I'm feeling a little castrated today because my voice, but my ability to think and to speak is my phallus. Okay, so I tell my wife, if she sees me slipping into Alzheimer's, kill me, quickly. Okay, that's a castration I can't face and don't want to ever have to face. So castration is losing that thing which makes us desirable to others. The Oedipus complex, Lacan metaphorizes it. It's not just the literal mother and the literal father and the literal child. People often say, well, what if there's a single mother raising her son? How can that son have an Oedipus complex? Jean-Paul Sartre, by the way, was really dumb about this. He said he didn't have an Oedipus complex because his father died when he was only a few months old, and he was raised by his mother in his grandfather's house. He had a huge Oedipus complex because he had his mother all to himself for a long time, and then she got a boyfriend and married him, and Sartre was enraged. Sartre was forever attracted to incestuous situations. He even knew it. He acknowledged that he was attracted to incestuous situations. He was a total narcissist, Sartre. He got de Beauvoir to homosexually seduce her students, and then she would turn these girls over to Sartre. And Sartre particularly liked breaking the hymen, and then he would turn these girls over to his buddies. And one mother brought a suit against Sartre, and Sartre and de Beauvoir and all of their friends, they rehearsed before going into court, and they got it thrown out of court. That girl was later analyzed by Jacques Lacan, who said that her whole breakdown was due to incest because she had been more or less adopted by de Beauvoir and Sartre in loco parentis. And so her parents essentially, symbolically, were using her and abusing her sexually. So Sartre was a nasty fellow on that level. But he thought he didn't have an Oedipus complex. He had a huge Oedipus complex. What about the single mother raising her boy with no father around? Lacan enables us to understand that that boy meets his father every time the mother says, no, you can't come into the bathroom. No, you can't touch me there. He meets his father when he says, "Stay home with me," and she says, "No, I'm going out to the movies with my girlfriend." I guess the girlfriend or the movie is the father. The bathroom door is the father. Any boundary, any barrier, any no is the father. So Lacan is not talking about the literal father anymore at all. He's talking about what he calls the paternal function, which is the no, which divides the two. It's the third who comes between the two. And so everybody has an Oedipus complex. Sometimes it's a lot easier to resolve the Oedipal thing when there is an actual father who is saying no. Because then you're being told no by a guy who also teaches you how to ride a bike, who takes you to the J's, so that makes it easier to come to grips with this painful triangular business. So we read Freud much more metaphorically once we've read him through Jacques Lacan, and that's very important, it seems to me. Okay, what else to say about Lacan? I think I'm going to leave it at that for the moment and flip back to Kohut, because there's an interesting parallel between Kohut and Lacan, because again, Kohut is really trying to address narcissism, and he's making narcissism central. Okay, Heinz Kohut, 1913 to 1981, born in Vienna to assimilated Jews. In 1938, he began analysis with August Aichhorn. Aichhorn was an analyst who wrote a wonderful book called Wayward Youth. And this guy, Aichhorn, he worked with delinquent adolescents. And he had a genius for working with delinquent kids. And his secret was that he joined them in their delinquency. He adopted totally anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment, rebellious attitudes. He kind of validated their rebelliousness. And in that way, he kind of got past the resistance to a considerable degree. Now that's a joining technique. And there are two psychoanalysts who learned most from Aichhorn. Heinz Kohut, who was analyzed by Aichhorn, and Hyman Spotnitz, who was supervised by Aichhorn. Hardly anyone in Canada has ever heard of Hyman Spotnitz. He was more or less kicked out of the New York Psychoanalytic, and he went downtown and formed his own institute, and there's still a journal to this day. It's called Modern Psychoanalysis. They call themselves modern analysts. They have institutes in Manhattan, in Philadelphia, New Jersey, Boston, a bunch of other places. And they're very influenced by this technique of joining that Spotnitz got from Aichhorn. Kohut also got it from Aichhorn. And it enables you to work, it's a technique that enables you to work with narcissistic people who are very hard to work with from a mainstream psychoanalytic point of view. Kohut doesn't go as far with the joining as Spotnitz does. Spotnitz really does a thing he calls joining the resistance. Well, let me back up and say a little bit about Freud and resistance. When Freud first started writing about resistance, he used all of these military metaphors. Like the resistance has to be conquered. It's like a war situation. The resistance has to be conquered. And then he wakes up and realizes, but wait a minute, it's not just a matter of getting rid of the resistance. You can do that with hypnosis. And that doesn't lead to insight and working through. He realizes, no, we have to analyze the resistance, not just get rid of it, not just conquer it, but make it a part of the analysis to draw the patient's attention to the fact that he is resisting, and draw his attention to how he's resisting, and draw his attention to why he's resisting. So Freud is getting a friendlier attitude towards resistance now. It's part of what the analysis involves. Spotnitz goes even further. He says, not only do we analyze the resistance, but sometimes we join the resistance. Sometimes we even prescribe the resistance. So a Spotnitz person, say someone approaches you with an alcohol problem and they say, Carveth, I want you to help me overcome my alcoholism. And if I'm a modern analyst, I might say, and he says, I'm quitting today and I'm not having another drink. And I'm saying, are you being a little hasty? Are you sure that it's a good idea to stop drinking suddenly? You've been drinking apparently all your life and you're telling me you're just going to stop? And I don't even know, we're just starting here. Are you sure? I'm not telling him not to stop, but I'm not signing on to his attempt to put me in the position of the guy who's going to make him stop drinking. Because if I let him put me into that position, he's going to defeat me. Okay? It's like someone approached me after a conference a number of years ago and said she'd had 4 different therapists and none of them had enabled her to overcome her bulimia. But having heard me speak, she was confident that I'm the guy who could finally cure her of her bulimia. So I showed very little interest in this project, but anyway, she wanted to come to talk to me, okay, so she came to talk to me, and basically pretty much what I said in the first interview was, therapy's expensive and time-consuming, and after all, what's so bad about barfing every once in a while? I mean, all things considered, is it such a terrible price? But if you want to talk about other things, I'm willing to talk. So we started talking, but I refused to make the barfing the whole be-all and end-all of the therapy. Okay? That is a joining technique. Sometimes the Spotnitzians will even go further, like if the person came and reported, I haven't been barfing for the last week, the Spotnitzian might say, oh, I think you probably need to barf this week. They might even prescribe the old, they go far with this, the joining. And the mirroring. Mirroring is the patient is wasting his time by sinking into a masochistic, depressive, I'm so terrible, I'm your worst patient, I must be the worst patient you've ever had, we're not getting anywhere, it's my fault, I'm just so terrible, I'm useless. And I start saying, look, I apologize to you, I think it's my inexperience, I probably need supervision, I'm sorry that we haven't gotten any further. Okay, I'm mirroring him. And now he's cheering me up. Okay, he's pulled out of his malignant regression and he's cheering me up. It's just kind of reverse psychology in a way, but you'd be amazed at somehow these techniques are sometimes useful. I don't want to misrepresent the modern analysts. They don't want to do this stuff if ordinary rational technique works. If they can analyze you the way an IPA analyst will analyze you, that's what they want to do. But what they want to say is that people who don't want to deal with these techniques and want to adhere to the IPA rational technique, they're limiting their practice. If you want to limit your practice, fine, then you can engage in pure truth therapy and not do any of this Zen stuff. Okay, back to Kohut. Kohut was analyzed also by Aichhorn. And Kohut's technique doesn't go as far as Spotnitz with joining and mirroring, but his technique is a mirroring technique. He calls it an empathic technique. It's about trying to be in tune with the patient. It's trying to never confront the patient with difference, because narcissists can't stand differences. And so you empathize with their point of view, you immerse yourself in their point of view. When things get a little derailed, you systematically decenter from your point of view and immerse yourself in their emotionally attuned to them, empathize with them. It's not quite as far down the continuum, but it's still a technique based on not confronting the patient with difference. Ronald Britton is a British Kleinian, neo-Kleinian, and he also has done a lot of thinking about narcissism. And but being Kleinian, he recognized with these very narcissistic patients, you can't interpret. They won't let you interpret anything. But he got into the idea, which is also a Spotnitzian idea. He didn't get it from Spotnitz, but one of Spotnitz's ideas is silent interpretation. Being a psychoanalyst, I want to interpret, but I daren't speak my interpretation to this patient. But I'll still interpret. I'll give the interpretation to myself silently. So Britton is giving himself these interpretations. And one patient says to him, "Stop that fucking thinking." Okay? So Britton's not even allowed to have thoughts that are potentially different from the thoughts that the patient is having. Stop that fucking thinking. Which is also very interesting phrasing from, we haven't gotten into Bion very much in this course, but Bion thinks of thinking as a coupling activity in which a preconception links with a realization leading to a conception, which is a third thing, analogous to biological conception. So if I'm thinking, thinking is a kind of internal fucking, in which a couple of things are coming together to give rise to a new thing, okay? And the patient can't stand this. So stop that fucking thinking, says the patient. So Kohut, okay, so let's come back to early Kohut. Beginning in the 1950s, analysts around the world are encountering this new kind of patient. I've already quoted Erik Erikson. Erikson says the patients before 1950, they came thinking they knew who they were and they knew who they ought to be, but they wanted help because they couldn't be it. They couldn't be who they knew they were and ought to be. In other words, they were in conflict. They wanted to be a heterosexual man, but they had these homosexual urges. They wanted to be a loyal husband, but they had these urges. Okay, then this new kind of patient arrives. It's not that he knows who he is and who he ought to be but can't be it. He doesn't know who he is, and he doesn't know who he ought to be. Okay, so he doesn't come with conflict. He comes with emptiness, lostness, confusion. And when these patients come into treatment, the Freudian analyst is getting bored and having trouble staying awake because psychoanalysis, Freud distinguished the narcissistic neuroses from the transference neuroses, and he said the narcissistic neuroses are unanalyzable. Why? Because they don't form transferences. The transference neuroses are people who form transferences. Object instinctual transferences. That is, these are people who, when they come to analysis, they fall in love, they fall in hate. They start having all kinds of emotions towards the analyst, which keeps the analyst awake. Because it's emotion, it's affect that keeps us awake. Okay? But these people come, and they don't fall in love with us. They don't fall in hate with us. They go on and on and on about themselves forever. What am I, chopped liver? I'm sitting back here. Patients showing no interest. They're showing up. But, there's no transference. So Freud is right. These are narcissistic neuroses. These are unanalyzable. You throw them out of analysis.
Doesn't that mean that the analyst is also a bit narcissistic if they need that from a patient?
Well, that's probably quite true too. But we can't ignore the fact that they were trained to think this way. Quite apart from any personal narcissism they may have had, and there are some analysts who are terribly narcissistic, and these are analysts who need their patients to fall in love with them. Oh, well, let me tell you a story about that. So there was the only analyst in Calgary for 40 years was Ron Aldous. And Ron Aldous died a few years ago. He trained in Montreal, and as a young psychiatrist training in Montreal, one of his training cases, he wrote a paper just before he died, and I published it in the Canadian Journal. I really like this paper. This woman patient says, at the start of analysis, she says to him, "So, this is psychoanalysis. Does this mean I have to fall in love with you?" And Aldous says, "No. And if you do, I'll feel we've gone off the track somewhere." Well, his supervisors almost threw him out of training for saying that. They were outraged. You're blocking the transference. You're preventing the transference from developing by telling the patient no. Okay? So he goes on and practices for 40 years, and finally he writes a paper about this. And basically the field has pretty much caught up with him, because nowadays there's a fairly widespread recognition that if the patient does form an intense erotic transference, it's probably got something to do with the analyst as much as it has to do with the patient. I mean, a properly functioning analyst heads that off at the pass in subtle ways. You know, not by a superego prohibition, not through moral judgment, but he sees it as a resistance. He sees that it's not the point. He sees that her biological clock is running. What good's it going to do to her at 35 to fall in love with her analyst and spend the next 10 years loving her analyst instead of finding a man and having babies? Right? So, okay, I'm not saying that the analyst's narcissism isn't a problem, but I'm saying that's always going to be an issue.
I was just curious.
Yeah, no, I just want to make the point that quite apart from the analyst's narcissism, there's the fact that a whole generation of analysts were trained by Freud to think that people who don't form object instinctual transferences are unanalyzable. Because analysis works through the analysis of transference. Okay, these patients don't form ordinary transferences. Yes?
The characterization that Erickson had of post-1950 patients were empty, didn't know who they wanted to be. In your opinion, is that still the case? Or, I mean, I know you can't generalize, of all of your patients
Right.
or current generations, but do you think that's still a problem, or have we evolved into a new sub-issue?
Okay, can someone bring me back to this point? Well, before answering your question, let me just say that Kohut's contribution is the recognition that these patients who don't form object instinctual transferences do form transferences, but of a different type. And therefore they are analyzable. They don't form object instinctual transferences, they form what Kohut calls self-object transferences. And that's a whole different kettle of fish. And therefore they opened the eyes of many analysts who would ordinarily have thrown these people out of analysis, or have felt helpless and irritated by them for not forming object instinctual transferences. But suddenly the analyst is now able to say, oh, wait a minute, these are transferences, but of a very different kind. This is a major contribution, in my opinion. Now, of course, I'm going to come to do a critique of Kohut, because while he made a major contribution, instead of just realizing that he contributed an important slice of the psychoanalytic pizza, he started thinking he had the whole pizza. And that's a major problem. I mean, he inflated his slice into the whole pizza, Okay, but now let me come to your question. Okay, Kohut made a big distinction between what he called guilty man and tragic man. Guilty man was the patient pre-1950 who came with guilt, conflict. Okay? Tragic man is the new kind of patient who comes with emptiness and what Erickson calls identity diffusion. Okay? That's tragic man. And Kohut goes on to produce a whole new psychology of tragic man called self-psychology. These are people who come without a self or with a highly fragmentation-prone self. Now, Herbert Marcuse said something very similar around the same time. I think in the late 50s, early 60s, he wrote an essay called The Obsolescence of the Freudian Concept of Man. Why was the Freudian concept of man obsolescent? Because Freud had been right, but was now wrong, because the society had changed. The Freudian model had applied to the pre-1950 man, but it was no longer applying to the post-1950 man, because the pre-1950 man had a structured self, id, ego, superego conflicts. Post-1950, you have the unstructured personality, which is Kohut's tragic man, which is, okay? Now, I believe that there's, on a phenomenological descriptive level, they're describing something real. But I reject their fundamental thinking, because what they fail to grasp is that tragic man is only different on the surface. They've lost sight of the unconscious. On the deeper unconscious level, you still got guilty man. And in my opinion, one of the reasons that the self has fragmented, tragic man's self is fragmented, is because he has a primitive superego who's fragmenting him. The self is in pieces because, okay, Kohut sees the whole. He doesn't realize the whole is a crater left by a bomb. He just sees the whole. And then he naively thinks that this person has a hole because they didn't have enough good empathy poured into them in childhood. This patient is empty because of an absence of empathy. These poor deprived patients. It's all deprivation. It's all deficit. It's all deficit. There's no rage. There's no, whereas in fact these patients are usually highly enraged. Only they haven't got a clue that they're enraged. It's deeply repressed. They do have a superego of a very primitive sort, and it's busy pulverizing them. Why do they have no self-esteem? Because there's something at work in them telling them that they are shit. That's why they have no self-esteem. No, I'm not denying that they were deprived of empathy and love at the beginning. They were. But anyone who's deprived of empathy and love becomes enraged. And it's the rage that is left out in self-psychological thinking. Of course they're deprived. But deprivation or trauma, I mean, trauma people who fail to understand how trauma yields rage. How are you gonna be traumatized and not be enraged? And what happens to the rage? It's turned on the self, and the self is fragmented as a result. Yeah.
So just to summarize, just so I'm clear, you do see a shift.
Yes.
There still is a shift to the extent that this new patient is somehow recognized, but at the same time you're saying, yes, a new patient, but there are still these underlying structural dynamics.
Yes.
But they're in kind of a hyperdrive, if you will,
Or
in a sense. Or that there is, what I'm getting at is you're saying that it's still the same structurally, in a sense, in terms of the mechanism of conflict. But there's been a shift.
Yes.
And the shift is, in a sense, post-war historical.
Yes, I believe
So
that.
a new subject, in a sense, without putting too much of an
Well,
emphasis.
that's making it too extreme, a new subject, because
Right.
what I'm saying is that those older dynamics have simply been radically pushed underground. It's pushed unconscious. So I'm saying that what the change is a phenomenological. Okay,
Right.
let's use the iceberg metaphor.
Right.
On the on the above the water line, you're seeing something that looks quite different. But if you get those people into analysis, and the analysis progresses, you're going to find it ain't so different. You know, now to get them into analysis, you have to behave differently. You can't behave like the old Freudians behaved with these new people. They can't be analyzed in the old way. So you're going to have to spend, and you can learn a lot from Heinz Kohut. So that people often look at me, see, ordinarily, Kohut and Melody Klein are seen as like oil and water. They can't mix. They're like opposites. See, Kohutians hate Kleinians. They think that Kleinians are like the worst. They think that Kleinians are like the Nazis of the analytic world, you know, talking about hate, rage, you know. But I, in a way, I'm kind of a Kohutian Kleinian, because the Kohutian part is the way you start the work with very narcissistic people. You don't interpret. You build a therapeutic alliance. You're gentle. You're empathic. You don't try to interpret. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. You got your Kleinianism contained, maybe for 5 years. But by the way, this is exactly Spotnitz. Spotnitz was kind of like a Native American. He didn't study Klein, but he almost came up with, on his own, he came up with a lot of Kleinian theory. He thinks that psychosis is intense rage and murderousness turned against your own mental apparatus. He sees aggression as the core of psychopathology. He sees psychotic patients as absolutely enraged, and therefore they're afraid you're going to kill them because they want to kill you, only they don't know it, and they're turning their rage on themselves. So Spotnitz says the analyst must always have his chair by the door and the couch inside the room, so if the patient gets off the couch and becomes homicidal, you can get out of the office before the patient can get to you. I mean, and Spotnitz believed that no analysis is going to be any good unless it eventually gets into this murderousness, this rage. That's and that's Kleinianism. Klein's whole critique of Freud is that he never analyzed the negative transference. Freud didn't like negative because of Freud's narcissism. Freud did not like to be hated. He liked to be loved. And one of the reasons I think he didn't like to be hated is because when you're hated, you hate back. And he didn't want to hate back. And so, he didn't want to go there. And Klein says that's the trouble with the Freudians. They dodge the negative transference. So Spotnitz was kind of like a Kleinian, but he would go for 10 years like a self-psychologist. He would go for 10 years not interpreting anything. He would go for 10 years just empathizing, joining, mirroring, And in that, you're building a therapeutic alliance. And gradually the patient may come to feel sufficiently safe. Oh, here's what the Spotnitz people do. It's brilliant for working with narcissists. They call it contact function. I'm silent. I'm not saying anything. Finally, the patient says, "So, Carveth, what do you think?" And I might say, "Well, I do have a thought about what you've been saying, but I'm not sure it would be helpful for you to hear my thought at this point." "Oh, come on, tell me your thought, it's fine." "Are you sure it would be good for me to share my thought about this with you now?" "Yes, I want to hear what you think." So they have to beg me to say what I am thinking. Now, what's the function of this? They learn that they will never hear anything from me that they don't want to hear. Okay? So they're in control of the analysis. They're never going to get ambushed. They're never going to get attacked with an interpretation of some sort that's going to disrupt them and derail them. Because I'm not ever going to tell them anything unless they ask me to tell them. So they're in control. So now they can relax. And their anxiety level goes down. And if we do this over a long enough period of time, there's such trust built up that finally we can begin to talk turkey to one another eventually. And then you're moving into a real analysis now. Okay? In year 15. You're getting now maybe into a real analysis.
So that's a real alliance building
It's an alliance building.
technique.
I think the whole of self-psychology is an alliance building technique. And I think it's really useful, and I think beginning therapists should learn self-psychology, because at least with that they can't do much harm, and they can begin to build an alliance, and then eventually they can move on to have something like a real analysis. You could call it pre-analytic, In a certain way, I think of it as pre-analytic work with thin-skinned narcissistic people.
Teenagers.
Teenagers,
It works
yeah.
well with teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, teenagers are like narcissistic.
That's exactly
as
why I said
hell.
that.
I mean, they're operating on a kind of a borderline level. And that's where August Aichhorn started. And that's Kohut's analyst. And that's Spotnitz's supervisor. Okay? So I think I've answered your question. Phenomenologically, this change is real, but it's only a surface change. Underneath tragic man, guilty man is alive and well. Only he can't be talked about for a long time. That's all.
What's a self-object transfer?
Okay, that's good. I'm coming back to that. Okay. When Kohut first introduced the concept of the self-object transferences, he spelt self-object self-object. He later eliminated the hyphen and just spelt it self-object. What he meant at the beginning of a self-object is an object incompletely differentiated from the self. In other words, if for my patient I am a self-object, I am an object incompletely differentiated from him. In other words, the difference between him and me is negated, is eradicated in his mind. He and I are the same. And therefore he expects to have control over me like he has over his big toe. Because I'm not a separate person. That's what he means by self-object at the beginning. In other words, and at that time he also spoke of a merger transference. So he was talking about merger states, fusional states, where the boundary between him and me is kind of non-existent. Okay?
Is this for treating narcissists or for treating any?
Well, he's
patients?
basically setting out to talk about treating narcissists, right? He then extends that eventually. My metaphor for what happens to Kohut is we've all read Conrad's and then Apocalypse Now, the film based on Heart of Darkness. And in Heart of Darkness, Kurtz, played by Brando, takes his army and goes into Cambodia, and he breaks off relations with headquarters. That's what Heinz Kohut does. He breaks off relations with headquarters and takes his army into Cambodia. That is, he breaks off relations with the Freudian establishment and tries to pretend his piece of the pie is the whole pie, right? Now self-psychology is for all patients. But when he starts, it's for these particular patients, narcissistic patients. And he's defining self-object as an object incompletely differentiated from the self. Now, suddenly, and fairly quietly, he changes his definition of what a self-object is. Suddenly, he eliminates the hyphen and he starts defining it as an object that performs needed functions for the self. Not incompletely differentiated from the self, but an object that performs functions for the self. Why does he make this change? Does anyone have a guess?
Can you repeat that definition before?
Okay, the new definition is an object that performs needed functions for the self, not an object incompletely differentiated from the self. Yeah.
It's akin to, I would say, dare I say, akin to Jungian persona or defense mechanism.
Akin to what?
Akin to some sort of persona or some defense mechanisms to maintain some sort of distance.
Well, but that's okay. But that's not the reason why he changes his definition. Yeah.
Maybe because then the patient would view the analyst as doing something for them.
No. I'll give you the hint here. Remember Freud's concept of primary narcissism. That at the beginning of life, there's no I, not I distinction. All is one. And that got shot down by the infant research. Melanie Klein's first disagreement with Freud is to say there is no primary narcissism. There is no time when the I and the not I are merged. There is a primitive ego in relation to a primitive object from the get-go, says Klein. Otto Kernberg stabs Melanie Klein in the back, and when he goes to the manager, because he's not going to be accepted at the manager if he follows Klein instead of Freud. So he buys into the myth of primary narcissism, oneness at the beginning, and he gets himself accepted at the manager. And then he smuggles a bunch of Klein in, having gotten inside the walls. It's a Trojan horse strategy. I think he's a brilliant psychoanalytic politician, Otto Kernberg. But coming back to, so Kohut is keeping up with the infant research. And he sees that the infant research shoots down the idea of undifferentiation. So he can't define his self-object as an object incompletely differentiated from the self. There is no primary, there is no oneness. There is no merger. There are no merger transferences. Okay, so he drops the merger transference. He drops the early definition of self-object. He redefines it as an object. That is, a separate object. Not merged, separate, but performing needed functions. What are these functions? These are the so-called self-object functions. Soothing, empathy, attunement, understanding. Okay, and then he proceeds to list the self-object transferences. The first is the mirroring self-object. No longer merger, mirroring. And this is mother. Mother is the mirroring self-object. What's her function? To have a beam in her eye when she looks at her child. The child is saying, "Look, Ma, no hands." And that's my boy. The look of pride, the look of love, the look of validation. That's mirroring. And that's the child's first chance to put together a cohesive self through the mother's mirroring function. If mother is too depressed to mirror properly, if mother is too narcissistic to mirror properly, the kid can't put together a cohesive self. He remains fragmented. Unless he can make use of his second chance, father. If he can't be properly mirrored by mother, if he can idealize his father, he idealizes father and he merges, he tries to identify with the father's calmness, the father's strength. I've got the biggest and the best dad, and I'm like my dad, and my dad and I are like each other. I'm going to be just like dad. And now he can put together a cohesive self. Even though he didn't get the mirroring from mother, he's able to idealize and identify with father. If he can't do either of these things, if he can't be mirrored and if he can't idealize, then he's left with what Kohut calls a fragmentation-prone self. Okay? And that means that he has no stable self-esteem. He can't regulate his self-esteem properly. And he's prone to turning to what Kohut calls disintegration products. To fragment is very painful. It's a nightmare experience, a fragmentation, a collapse of self-esteem, a terrible feeling of emptiness, a terrible feeling of shame, terrible emptiness, terrible fragmentation. It's the worst. So you hit the bottle, or you snort cocaine, or you go to a strip bar, or hire a hooker, or cruise bathhouses, or whatever. Or you turn to rage. Some people hold themselves together with substances. Other people hold themselves together with rage and hate. But you do something. And this is not, it looks like these are driven people, but this is not, drive theory doesn't explain this. These are not people who are driven by sex or aggression. These are people who turn to sex or turn to aggression to hold themselves together in the face of fragmentation.
What did you refer that term to as?
The disintegration product.
Sorry.
A disintegration product. The self disintegrates. And these people turn to these things to try to hold themselves together. Which means that they end up looking for love in all of the wrong places. Right? What they really want is an empathic self-object, another term for which is a loving, genuinely caring connection to another human being. That's what they want, is a loving connection to another human being. But they can't get that So instead they turn to substances.
What about babies who are like in orphanages who like get adopted when they're 2? Like, is that young enough to like get this? Like, if you don't have it when you're a baby, obviously in an orphanage. Like, I know a little girl who was adopted when she was 2, and then she did the rocking thing. Like,
Well, I think you're
But-
dealing there with a child who's already significantly damaged. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, the evidence of the kind of damage. I mean, did you ever see the films made in the 40s by the Robertsons? Okay, do you know about those films?
Yeah, we watched.
You've watched them,
We watched
okay.
them a few times, yeah.
They're heartbreaking.
Yeah, John, they talk about a 20-month-old, is John again? 20, 18 months? Anyways, within 9 days, you see him going from a very secure relationship and then at that time, mom put the child into the institution while they went and had another child.
Right.
And in 9 days, you see himself just disintegrate.
So you can be
9 days.
yeah,
Wow.
and you can be taken out of. I mean, these are often institutions that are extremely clean, healthy, professional nurses, professional nutritionists. But you know, there's one nurse to like 8 or 10 kids, and the kid just is not getting, you know. So.
And there were other children with him that had grown up and lived in the institutions, so he wasn't used to the noise, to the survival techniques of these young children, these other children.
Okay, so back to the self-object transferences. So the first one is mirroring. The second one is the idealized. Then they started adding some others. They added the twinship self-object. This is, it's called the alter ego self-object transferences. I mentioned a twinship transference I had where it was a twinship transference and countertransference. He was a physician 5 years younger than me. We had a lot in common. We liked each other. And for a month in his treatment, at the end of every session, his name was David. And at the end of every session, I'd say, okay, see you next week, David. Okay. We were twinning. I had him confused with me. He had himself confused with me. He laughed uproariously every time I called him Don. Eventually, you know, so that's a twinning going on. We were alter egos. That was the self-object connection between us. He was a self-object for me. I was a self-object for him. By the way, this is a contribution of Kohutian theory. The Kohutians got around to saying that it's not just that the analyst needs to provide self-object functions for the patient. The patient needs to perform some self-object functions for the analyst in order to help the analyst be an analyst. The analyst has to be looked after in order to function properly. And patients who can't provide self-object functions for their analysts are not going to be able to be helped by their analysts. I mean, an analyst shouldn't require major self-object. I mean, the analyst should ideally be a little healthier than the patient. You know, I mean, ideally, majorly healthier. But the point is that we do need. I mean, patients take care of us. Like if I say something useful to the patient, and the patient comes back and tells me that's really useful. That was really useful. Thank you. Well, I just got self-object function from the patient, which enables me to carry on with my work. So, twinship, and then, adversarial is the fourth self-object transference. The patient begins to relate to the analyst as an adversary, but a kind of a beloved adversary. like a little boy at a certain point in his development enjoy his dad as his adversary. Maybe they'll wrestle. Maybe they'll have little competitions, maybe he'll dish it out to dad, and maybe dad won't always agree with him, and and it's not getting hostile and coming to blows or anything, but dad is not a pushover. Dad has a certain solidity. And so Kohut's insight is that the self can be strengthened through the kind of affirmation that comes from a certain kind of resistance, a certain kind of struggle. That's not always a matter of agreement. That's the adversarial self-object. Yeah.
But in that situation, there has to be a trust, though, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. As there is among a father
For sure.
who loves his son, and the son loves the father,
Yeah.
and they're struggling, and I mean, thinking of my struggles with my dad late in my adolescence, and I mean, I became a flaming Trotskyist, and I was carrying the bags full of, communist literature, and my father was this right-wing family doctor. We got to the point where we couldn't have a meal together without almost literally coming to blows. But nevertheless, somehow we survived, we got past it. We had many disagreements, but, and of course, part of myself was firmed up through disagreeing with him. I was able to sort of find out who I am through, and he didn't cave. Like, I didn't blow him out of the water, and he didn't blow me out of the water, and that's adversarial. But as you say, within a context of a certain kind of trust. Yeah. Adversarial. And then a fifth self-object function, later on, some self-psychologists began, I think quite brilliantly, although I think other people had arrived at this idea long before. This is the abstract self-object. We know that often those people who were in the death camps who believed in God survived better than the atheists. Because often the atheists fell into despair and threw themselves against the electric fence. Because being surrounded by an environment that tells you that you're shit. But the religious believed that there was a self-object, God, who loved them, who saw them, cared about them, loved them, and they were able to sustain themselves through this abstract self-object, God, if you're able to pull off that act of belief. Other people did an abstract self-object in a slightly different way. Some people who are in solitary confinement, they sustain their sense of self by using memory. Memory of parents who loved them, memory of spouses who loved them, memories. There's a wonderful book by the anthropologist Laura Bohannon about her experience among the Tiv of northern Nigeria. She was living with these people for a couple of years, cut off from all Europe. This is the days before internet and communication, and she's living with them. And they believe in black magic and sorcery and so on. And she's starting to go native. Anthropologists write about the dangers of going native, which means you stop studying the culture, you're sucked into the culture. Okay? And this is starting to happen to her. And she hangs on to her identity as a civilized European by returning to her hut every night and reading Shakespeare. Okay, so in a sense that's a bit of an abstract self-object too, reminding her of her European education and her European culture. She hangs on to a sense of self that way. So I think this is a useful concept, the abstract self-object function. So these are ways that we hang on to a sense of self. But when okay, so now you're sitting with these narcissistic patients, and they're not falling in love with you, they're not falling in hate with you, but you begin to realize, wait a minute, they're using me as a self-object. They're showing off in front of me because I'm supposed to be the mirroring mother that they never had. Okay? Which I was trying to do with Robin Hunter when I came bragging into his office about the 2 articles that I finally managed to write. And he says, Professor Carveth, 2 swallows do not a summer make. All I wanted him to say was, good work, boy. Okay? I was looking for a mirroring self-object from Robin Hunter. Forget it!
An abstract one.
I should have made my own. Yeah, exactly. I'm not knocking Robin, he was a great guy, I got a lot out of my analysis, but he was operating like an old-style Freudian prior to self-psychology. This was before Kohut wrote. And so, you know, he was not understanding that I was a mirror-hungry personality, and was not able to adjust his technique. So suddenly these people become analyzable. And the analyst isn't bored anymore, because there are transferences happening, self-object transferences. This is a major contribution to work with this particular category of patient. The problem, however, is that, as I've said, they take a piece and pretend it's the whole deal. And what they're really blind to is that the patient's lack of self-esteem isn't just that they didn't get proper mirroring or couldn't idealize properly. All of that's true, but because mother didn't mirror, they developed hatred of mother. And because father couldn't be properly idealized, or having been idealized, the cops came to the door and took him away for embezzling at the bank or whatever, and the idealization crashed, they hate father. There's hate in their hearts, and therefore there's guilt. Because you can't hate without guilt. Even if the people you hate completely merit your hate, doesn't matter whether they deserve it or not. You can't go on hating them and like yourself because you're a hater. It's impossible to like yourself when you're full of hate. I'm not saying that the hate isn't justified often. I'm just saying even justified hate, you walk around hating, no matter how justified your hate, you're not going to like yourself. Yeah.
Did Kohut talk about the Oedipal complex in the case of mirroring? Because I could see it kind of two ways. Like if you're getting the mirroring, then one, you could understand the Oedipal complex in one sense, and if you're not getting it, then you could see it a whole other way in terms of father presence and all
Yes.
of that. What is the?
He does talk about the
Yeah.
Oedipus complex, but in a very, very different way. He argues that that the Oedipus complex that Freud describes as normal is abnormal. He's in describing the Oedipus complex as it works its way out in a normal child who, due to castration anxiety, gives up on having mommy, lets daddy have mommy, gives up hating daddy because it creates too much anxiety, castration anxiety, fear. This is sick, says Kohut. This is not the normal Oedipus complex. This is an Oedipus complex on the part of an already disturbed child. And the child is already disturbed because he didn't get adequate mirroring. And he wasn't able to properly idealize in the first place. If he had gotten proper mirroring and proper idealization, the Oedipus complex would have not been a big deal. He would have wanted mommy, he would have wanted to push daddy out of bed. As daddy's getting pushed out of bed, he's not getting angry at the kid or feeling threatened or jealous. He's got a smile on his face because his little boy is acting like a little man. And he's responding empathically to the child's competitiveness. He's not getting hostile to the boy. And in the face of the little boy's seductiveness towards mommy is responding properly. She's not getting turned on. She's not being a Yocasta. Neither is she humiliating him. He says, Mommy, who do you love most, me or Daddy? She says, I love you both, dear, but in different ways. Whatever, you know. So if the parents had behaved as proper self-objects, the kid would have come through without having the whole thing inflamed, okay? That's Kohut's answer. I think it's a little simplistic. I mean, I think that the Oedipus complex, even with very empathic self-objects, is still going to be a big problem. I think there's some truth to what he's saying. I think that...
maybe in terms of degree of the
yeah,
issue.
degree. I think it's a matter of degree. It's going to be a problem anyway.
Because I could see if I were really well mirrored and really well supported by my mother, then I would be intensely jealous of any time that my father would interfere with that. And I would also, on the other side of it, if I weren't mirrored properly, I might blame my father
Right.
for stealing that from me in some
Absolutely.
way.
Absolutely. And the other thing that Kohut leaves out here, it seems to me, is fantasy. I mean, his whole focus is on how the parents really behave, as if we only live in reality. Children don't live in reality. They live in this crazy mixture of reality and fantasy. And children often get things really wrong. So a little boy has got major castration anxiety because he sees his father as castrating. Now sometimes it's because father is castrating. God knows there are plenty of castrating fathers. Okay? But sometimes it's the boy who's castrating. He's so full of penis envy. You know, one of the remarkable things is Anna Freud gives all of these examples of little boys who've got penis envy. But she won't call what she's describing male penis envy, because according to her father's theory, males can't have penis envy. And yet her clinical examples are clearly examples of male penis envy. It's kind of hilarious in a way. So the little boy's got all of this envy. Wow, Jack and the Beanstalk. You know, I mean, the cow stops giving milk, and so mother gives him money to go and buy milk, but he doesn't buy milk, he buys seeds from some man. And she's disappointed. He throws the seeds out the window, and this beanstalk goes up, and he climbs up, and there's the giant who has the harp that lays golden eggs. And the little boy is going to steal the magic flute or the magic harp and the hen that lays the golden egg. He's going to steal
all of these mixed up.
Oh, he's going to get all of these things, whatever. He's going to steal all of these valuable things from the old man. Okay? And then he hears the giant coming. Fee, fi, fo, fo, my smell of... who does he do? He runs to the giant's wife who hides him in her oven. She lets him crawl in her oven to hide from her husband. Okay? And then he goes down and the mother brings out the axe. The mother actually does the castration. But I don't know how I got onto Jack and the Beanstalk. It's something about the Oedipus complex. Yes?
Is there any connection or a more extreme extension of Kohut's lack of self being related to masochistic and perhaps sadistic extremes?
Again, I think he tends to see sadism and masochism as disintegration products. That is, he thinks that at the root is fragmentation of the self. And he thinks that different people opt for different pathological strategies for trying to hold themselves together. Some go to sadism. Some go to masochism. I mean, we know that some patients who are fragmentation prone hold themselves together by cutting themselves.
Well, I was thinking about borderlines.
Yeah, borderline cutting. That's masochism. That's inflicting pain on yourself as a way of holding yourself together. Other people hold themselves together by inflicting pain on other people. So that's how he approaches those conditions. Ultimately, it's rooted in, oh, you know what? We didn't take a break. Do you want to take a break for a few minutes, or do you want to just keep going and end maybe a little earlier? What do you want to do? Are people eager to take a break?
Well, it's up to you. You're the sicker one.
I'm okay. I just as soon keep going, unless...
Why don't we?
Just keep going?
Yeah.
All right, okay, let's continue then. Okay, we've talked about the self-object transferences. Okay, other valuable contributions of Heinz Kohut. The disruption repair cycle. How does it work? The analyst who is trying to be empathic and provide self-object function is going to fail, because we can't be perfectly empathic, we can't be perfectly attuned, And sometimes my empathy is going to fail, and the patient is going to be disrupted. And so, you know, perhaps he has stopped cocaine for the last few months, and then he arrives on Monday and tells me over the weekend he was back snorting cocaine again. As a self-psychologist, I'm going to be wondering what happened in Friday's session that might have triggered, how might I have empathically failed him on Friday's session and triggered a fragmentation that led him to have to go and try and hold himself together again by doing that old thing, whether it's being unfaithful to his wife or snorting cocaine or whatever it is. And so I'm listening on Friday. I'm not rushing in, but I'm listening, and very often it becomes pretty clear through the patient's associations that there was a fragmentation, that I had misunderstood something, or I had said something that was off, or I was off in some way. Something happened to break the self-object connection. The patient fragmented, hit the bottle. So we interpret that, and I'm able to say to him, I get it. I see what happened on Friday, and here's how you reacted, and here's why you went and did what you did. And by talking about this, we hook up again. We repair. That's the disruption. Now we have the repair. It's not about me saying I'm profoundly sorry. It's just me acknowledging that I was off. Perhaps I was developing a virus and wasn't with it. Who knows? But the point is that I was out of sync, and he fell apart, and he resorted to something. And okay, so we go through this a million times. This disruption repair cycle. We go through this a million times. And what happens through this? What happens is what Kohut calls transmuting internalization. Gradually, through this disruption, in other words, the disruptions are necessary. They're inevitable. They're necessary. Their repair is necessary. And through this, the patient internalizes my self-object function, internalizes my approach to recognizing, my acknowledging my role in the disruption, my repairing it through understanding, the bond getting healed again. Patient internalizes. Now this is the same theory of cure as Melanie Klein's. Again, everybody thinks that Klein and Kohut are poles apart. For Klein, the cure is the building up of a good internal object. The building up of a good internal object. Precisely through the mother's being able to be there and respond with her goodness and her love. This is gradually able to counteract my paranoid feelings of persecution at the hands of the bad mother by taking in the goodness of the good mother. That's Klein's theory of the cure. It's very similar, if not the same, as Kohut's idea of transmuting internalization, the building up of a good object. Now, I think there's a great deal of truth in all of this, but I think, again, it's only a small part of the picture. The patient's, this is not at all addressing the patient's guilt over hating. This is not addressing the patient's need to fragment himself as punishment for his crimes, his sins, his wrongdoing.
But wouldn't this be analyzed during the repair? Like, wouldn't this be material for analyzing during the cycle?
Well, it ought to be, but on the hands of
Disruption
self-psychologists, forget it. I mean, you know, there is no guilt in self-psychology. There is shame. Self-psychology is a theory of shame. It's not a theory of guilt. Guilty man is past. That's pre-1950. We're now into tragic man territory, say the self-psychologist. So it's all about empathic failure and repair, and it's all about healing through providing the self-object function that was missing in the first place, which, you see, I feel is dangerous for therapists. Let me just make this point first. Because, you see, essentially it's a theory of reparenting. It's a theory of reparenting, and therefore the analyst thinks that essentially his job is to do a better job than the original parents did. This is omnipotent. This is grandiose. Okay? And self-psychologists are incredibly quick to identify the flaws of the parents. They often do it in the first session. The mother failed you here, father failed you there, and now me, who is full of, all of this good stuff, I'm going to pour. You see, you got this cracks in yourself. I'm like crazy glue. I'm going to fill the cracks in yourself by pouring my empathic love into your cracks. Now you can imagine a slightly crazy male therapist. He's busy trying to fill cracks. And it isn't working right. The hole is not getting filled properly. So he starts to think he has to stick something else into it. Like maybe his penis. I think self-psychology is responsible for certain... that's too extreme. Let me back off a little bit. But look, I mean, if you, I'm not saying they're responsible for all boundary violations, but I'm saying if this is your only theory, you could easily get sucked into boundary violations.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because some papers that I've read, and I described, in some of the case studies, some of the things that they did, and they surprised me.
Kohut gave 2 fingers.
Really surprised me. Going for walks outside, doing certain things that...
Yeah.
I'm not judging it. I was just
Well, I mean,
aback by
look,
it,
I mean, this is
which mild.
This is why theory is so important. Theory is crucially important because how we end up acting depends on the theory that we have. And if your theory is that patients are cracked and broken because of inadequate provision, then therapy is providing. It's no longer just analyzing. It's no longer a matter of understanding. Now, Kohut himself was not so bad on this, because Kohut himself still believed in insight, and he believed in the analyzing of the self-object transferences. He was not so much into this reparative reparenting. In fact, Kohut himself was still defending the concept of optimal frustration. He believed that the therapeutic process involved an element of optimal frustration. I blame my old friend Howard Bacall, because Howard Bacall is one of the self-psychologists who turned away from optimal frustration to what he called optimal gratification. And that really moves self-psychology in the direction of a kind of a positive reparenting process. Well, I'm not so arrogant to think that I can be a better parent. I think if I can offer the patient some understanding, help him or her come to understand themselves. Because with understanding comes some self-control. I also don't feel I have to heal the patient. I mean, as a young therapist, I thought that I had to heal, and therefore, I took phone calls from patients at 2 a.m, whatever. But God heals or doesn't heal. I don't. If I'm not an emergency psychiatrist. If the patient is breaking down at 2 a.m, there are hospitals all around the city, emergency departments. Don't call me. I'm just an analyst. I analyze. Go to the hospital. I mean, if you call me and tell me you swallowed pills, I'll call the cops or an ambulance. But, I'm just an analyst. Self-psychology, it encourages a certain grandiosity on the part of the therapist, I feel. There was a question, yeah?
Yeah, I think it was Hartman who gave me this rumor about Freud that he may have taken some patients on vacation.
Oh, yeah, frequently. But it wasn't, it sounds worse than it is that there was a tradition in Vienna. You took a villa on the mountain, in the mountains, and the patients who wanted to keep seeing him, they took villas lower down the mountain, and they walked up the mountain for their sessions 5 times a week. It wasn't as if they all lived in the same cottage or hung out in the same hot tub. It wasn't like that. Okay. The disruption repair, the reparenting problem, and the failure to get at the unconscious is pretty much gone in self-psychology. The dynamic unconscious. The idea of an unconscious that operates according to a very different kind of law and logic and language, the language of the primary process. The unconscious that distorts. You see, like self-psychologists, and then after self-psychology came so-called intersubjectivity theory. Stollerow, Atwood, Brandschaft, these guys went off from self-psychology into something they called intersubjectivity theory. And then there are links with relational psychoanalysis. But certainly the intersubjectivity people, they hate the concept of distortion. And they hate the concept of resistance. They think that an analyst who thinks that the patient is resisting is merely an analyst who has a countertransference problem. In other words, he thinks the patient's resisting because he's out of empathic contact with the patient. If he were in proper empathic contact with the patient, he would understand that the patient is not resisting. That's what they believe. I think it's garbage.
They all have these very like all or nothing.
Well,
Do you know what I mean? Like there's no like.
read Hegel.
I'm just saying they
All or nothing.
all of
Thesis,
these patients,
antithesis.
all patients must fit into this category, or all patients must fit into this category.
Well, that's either or thinking, and
That's what they all seem to do. Everything's black and white for all of these, for
Well,
many
but
of these people.
not just in psychoanalysis, in any field of thought. This is the way this is the way thinking operates. This is the way.
Certainly Western thinking, yeah.
I'm just-
Yeah, well, Eastern thinking too, but Eastern thinking sees the problem like Hegel did and tries to overcome it by having having the Tao.
Right.
you know.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. But yeah. But you're quite right. We need to be able to take what's really valuable in self-psychology, and intersubjectivity theory, and put it together with what we have known for some time is valuable in mainstream psychoanalysis. We need integration, in other words. We need synthesis. But it's a very tall order because these are complex theories. I mean, it's a lifetime study to understand Freud thoroughly. It's like another little lifetime to understand Melanie Klein. And then another little lifetime to understand Kohut and intersubjectivity and relational psychoanalysis. This is a lot to understand. And it's only when you've kind of understood all of these perspectives that you begin to be in a position to try to draw them together. But I do think that, we've made great progress in this. In the 70s, this place almost split, because a bunch of the senior analysts who had been Freudians were going off to Chicago and sitting at the feet of Heinz Kohut, and coming back here, the scales had fallen from their eyes. Like for St. Paul, it happened on the road to Damascus. For them, it was the road to Chicago. And they came back with zeal. Peter Thompson, Ellie Markson, all these guys, they were like converts. And they came back and they were essentially sort of saying, all of those analyses that I did along Freudian lines were wrong. We should have a recall. They should all be redone along self-psychology, Kohutian lines. And at scientific meetings here, initially it was war, but then it stopped being war because to certain meetings only the self-psychologists showed up, to other meetings only the Freudians showed up, and the people who were caught in the middle were like me, the candidates, and I might have had a classical Freudian supervisor and a self-psychology reader of my reports, and oh my God, it was really difficult. The place almost had a schism. But then a middle group gradually emerged. Like in Britain, the middle group, the Freudians and the Kleinians and the middle group in England, something like a middle group emerged of people who were committed to sort of trying to learn all of these models. And that has grown. That middle group has grown, and the fanatical Freudians have diminished. The fanatical self-psychologists have diminished. Well, maybe they haven't entirely. Some of them just went off to their own institutes. They founded their own institutes, the Institute for the Advancement of Self-Psychology. These places that teach one point of view. Forgive me, it's not right. I mean, a Lacanian institute that teaches only Lacan, a self-psychology institute that teaches only self-psychology, a Freudian, I'm just as opposed to a Kleinian institute that teaches only Klein. This is irresponsible. You can't do that. You know, you have to be able to listen with all of these points of view. Anyway, we got a broad group. Now, here's an example of the same thing in America. So now we have, thank the Lord, we have someone like Nancy McWilliams. Now, she's a wonderful example. Not only is she a clear writer, but she's an integrationist, which kind of gives a nice segue into Otto Kernberg, because Nancy McWilliams is a Kernbergian. She's influenced by all kinds of people, but she's influenced heavily by Otto Kernberg. Okay. She's practical. She realizes that different patients require different theories and different techniques to be worked with. You don't work with all patients in exactly the same way. She's drawing on all of these different schools of thought. Okay, she's a follower of Otto Kernberg. Kernberg calls himself an ego psychology / object relations thinker.
Still alive?
He's still alive. He's old. I think he's probably the psychoanalyst who has had the greatest influence on psychiatry of any analyst other than Freud. Certainly in the last 50 years, because Otto Kernberg is the guy who put the borderline personality disorder on the map in psychiatry. Now, as I said earlier, he was trained in Latin America, initially as a Kleinian, and he comes to America, to the Menninger Institute, which is in the 1950s, and it's the bastion of Freudian ego psychology. Id, ego, superego, defense analysis, Anna Freud. And this place was ego psychology for very many years. When I trained here, there was not a single reading by Melanie Klein on the curriculum. You know, I mean, I learned Klein on my own after I graduated. So this place was ego psychology, as was the Menninger. Some of the people who were here were from the Menninger. So Kernberg would never have been accepted at the Menninger if he had hung on to Klein's basic disagreement with Freud, which is that there's no primary narcissism. The Menninger believed in primary narcissism. They believed that mental development, child development, is development out of oneness. First you get the first distinction is the I, not I distinction. Two-ness comes out of oneness, and then three-ness comes out of two-ness. But it's a kind of a wonderful myth of a primordial chaos and oneness, gradually two, I, not I. Boundaries are painfully being built up, which of course gave rise to a view of psychosis as the breakdown of boundaries back into the primordial ooze, which is why the ego psychologists were terrified of psychosis. So that if a patient started looking a little psychotic on the couch, they would immediately sit the patient up and start doing reality therapy or bring in phenothiazines or something, because civilization was collapsing back into chaos. The Kleinians don't believe in primordial chaos, so they see psychosis in a completely different way. The patient is getting confused not because boundaries are collapsing, but because the patient is projecting so much of himself into the other and introjecting so much of the other into the self that there's now confusion between self and other. So this is something that you work on, you interpret, you analyze this. Very different understandings. Anyway, to get accepted at the Kernberg, I don't know, at the Kernberg, at the Menninger, I don't know whether Kernberg cynically stabbed Klein in the back and bought into the myth of primary narcissism. I don't know whether he did it cynically or whether he actually believed it. But anyway, that's what he did. He bought into primary narcissism. He bought into the whole myth of development from oneness. But having done so, he got inside the Freudian walls. I said Trojan horse. Once in. Yeah.
Yeah, he was.
He got in there. And then he unleashed the Kleinian stuff. Because suddenly, having gotten in, he's now talking about splitting in a big way. He's identifying splitting as the central problem of the borderline personality. This is Melanie Klein's paranoid schizoid position, basically. He's talking about splitting, he's talking about projective identification. And he writes this great book called Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism, a great contribution to the understanding of narcissism, but in a very different way than Kohut. And so this big debate gets going between Kernberg and Kohut. What's the gist of the difference? Okay, let's talk about grandiosity. Kohut believed that there was a normal grandiose phase in childhood. There's a grandiose self in all children, and that's why the child wants mirroring. Look, Ma, no hands. And mother is supposed to affirm his grandiosity. And that grandiosity should only, for Kohut, gradually become disillusioned in a non-traumatic, gradual way. Little tiny, tiny disillusionments when the kid gradually comes to recognize his limits. Okay, Kernberg has a very different understanding of grandiosity. Grandiosity in a child is a sick child, as far as Kernberg's concerned. This is not normal. This is already a defense. It's a manic defense. Now he's being Kleinian. Kernberg is being Kleinian. It's a manic defense. The manic defense is going to the opposite. So here's a kid who feels prematurely powerless and therefore generates a fantasy of being all-powerful. Omnipotence. I once tried to make a formula of this. Ignorance of impotence is not omnipotence, is the way I put it. Ignorance of impotence is not omnipotence. In other words, the child is ignorant of his impotence. He's ignorant of his limits. I remember the Popeye cartoons, and the baby was called Sweet Pea, and Sweet Pea would crawl along girders that are being hoisted, and he'd fall off one girder, but another girder would be going right underneath, and he'd land safely on it. And he is crawling. He's completely ignorant of his impotence. He has no sense of limits. But that's not the same thing as being omnipotent. It's not like Sweet Pea has got his hand in his jacket, calling himself Napoleon. I mean, he's not grandiose. He just doesn't understand. Okay? So Kernberg will say that it's only sick infants who are omnipotent. They're forming a defensive grandiosity against feelings of helplessness, traumatic feelings of impotence, premature feelings of impotence. He doesn't accept normal grandiosity. Grandiosity is pathology. So once again, the adult grandiose narcissist is not someone who just has failed to have his normal grandiosity tamed. He's grandiose because he's in pain. because he's disturbed, because he's injured, because he has very low self-esteem. I tend to be with Kernberg on this in this debate. I mean, arrogant people are people who are arrogant as a defense against feelings of inferiority. People who don't feel inferior don't have to go around being arrogant. Okay, so again, Kernberg is drawing attention to defense.
But you don't agree with his childhood assessment?
No, I don't
Yeah,
accept
okay.
his, and I'll make that clearer in a minute, I don't accept his theory of development. And he comes to not accept it either. He converts, having dropped Klein. Eventually, 20 years later, in light of the infant research, Kernberg throws in the towel and admits there's no oneness at the beginning, just as did Fred Pine, the followers of Margaret Mahler. They all had to bow to the infant research, and so Kernberg had to change his model. It's the blackboard isn't here anymore. Let's do that while I'm talking about it. So here's Kernberg's model. Originally 4 stages of child development. Subject and object. The line being there's no differentiation, it's oneness. Okay, that's his stage 1. He buys primary narcissism. And he says the patients who get stuck in stage 1 are psychotic. Okay, stage 2, you still have no self-object differentiation. Self is merged with object, but you have 2 gestalts based on pleasure and pain. The child begins to distinguish a pleasurable, undifferentiated self-object from an unpleasurable or painful. In other words, the child begins to differentiate heaven from hell.
That's it's called differentiation.
Differentiate, but not self-object. See, the self and the object are still merged. You've got a positive self-object merger, heaven, and you've got a negative self-object merger, hell. But you don't have self separated from object. You just have pleasure separated from pain. Heaven separated from hell. Okay?
What's that stage called?
Again, the fixation point there is, again, psychosis. He's got 2 different levels of psychosis. I mean, this is a much deeper psychosis, totally undifferentiated. Here you've got a differentiation between good and bad, but no differentiation between self and object. Stage 3 is the borderline. Now you do have self-object differentiation, okay? But you've got an all-good self separated from an all-good object, and you've got an all-bad self separated from an all-bad object. Objects are either all good or all bad. Self is either all good or all bad. Borderline. Now this is an advance. At least this is a person who can split. Okay? Now splitting is a big problem, but at least they can split. They're not psychotic. They have micropsychotic episodes, but they usually pull it together fairly quickly. Borderline. Stably unstable. Their relationships are impossible. What's the borderline dilemma? I can't live with her. I can't live without her. Why? Because when I'm with her, when I'm in, I feel engulfed and smothered. So I have to go out. But once I'm out, I feel abandoned. So I have to go in. So Sham Shepherds plays Fool for Love. He has a bass drum built into the screen door of the motel unit where the play takes place, because throughout the play, bang, 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 because they're exploding apart, they're coming together, exploding apart, borderline. Finally, stage 4, neurosis. Now you've got self and object clearly separated, and the self is both good and bad, and the object is both good and bad. So this is ambivalence. I can sustain ambivalence towards myself. That is, so now I'm never depressed, because when I see my bad side, I remember my good side. And I can't hate clearly, because I also see the good side of the person I'm hating.
But it's also neurosis.
Well, it's neurosis because I'm stumbling over my own feet, because I can't carry out a consistent love because of my hate. And I can't carry out a consistent hate because of my love. So I'm neurotic. I'm shooting myself in the foot all the time. All right? I mean, I'm Woody Allen. Right? I mean, I'm working against myself. I can't, at least I'm not a cold killer. But I'm hampered in my loving by my hating. Unless I have a lot of analysis, then we would move on to some degree. There would not be, in my opinion, there's not a stage 5. there's just getting better. You get better. You get less conflicted. But it's not as if you break out of ambivalence. Conflict is the human condition, right? But some people are really crippled by their ambivalence conflicts. Okay, so what happens to Kernberg is, this is his theory in the 70s. By the 90s, he's had to abandon stage 1 and stage 2. They're wiped off the chart because the infant research shows there is no undifferentiation of self and object. So now his theory starts with stage 3 becomes stage 1. He's back to being a Kleinian. He's back to seeing the infant beginning in the paranoid schizoid position with splitting and gradually having to overcome that. So this modified model I like a lot, well, because I like Klein a lot to begin with. But I like it also because even more than Klein, he integrates this with Freudian ego-id superego thinking. I find the ego-id superego model really useful. As you know, I want to expand it to include conscience and ego-ideal. I want 5 structures, not just the 3. And if you do the math and you take out the overlaps, that gives you 15 conflicts. And we've only really carefully studied a handful of the 15 conflicts between id, ego, superego, ego-ideal, and conscience. So I think it's I call myself a Kleinian Freudian, and that's very much what Kernberg is, a Kleinian Freudian. And that's also what Nancy McWilliams is to a considerable degree. She acknowledges her debt to Otto Kernberg. So I find this to be quite useful way of thinking. What more to... again, Kernberg and Kohut. 2 different ways of understanding idealization. And I think here they're both right. But they're both right because they're talking about different patient populations. For Kernberg, in a Kleinian way, a patient comes in and is busy idealizing you, treating you like God. Ernest Jones, one of his papers was on the God complex, because he suffered from one. At least he was able to diagnose himself enough to write the paper about it. This is a problem with analysts who frequently get idealized by patients and it goes to their head, because of their own unresolved narcissistic problems. Anyway, patients come in and they start idealizing the analyst. The Kleinian is getting nervous because the Kleinian thinks you're putting me up because you want to kill me. You're idealizing me as a defense against malignant envy and rage towards me. So you're putting me up because eventually you're going to get around to tearing me down. So the fact that you're putting me up feels to me like I'm getting set up, and I'm aware of the rage, envy, and murderousness beneath your idealization. That's a Kleinian. That's also many Freudians. Suspicious of this idealization. And I think that's definitely true. A lot of patients do idealize in that way. That's one type of idealization. But Kohut says there's this... Kohut sees idealization quite differently. He says, this is a poor kid who tried to idealize his father because he was desperate to idealize his dad because mother had failed as a mirroring self-object. And idealizing his dad is his second chance to put together something like a cohesive self. And just as he was idealizing Dad, the cops came and took Dad away for embezzling at the bank and crashed the idealization. So here's a guy who's got a fragmentation-prone self. He's never been able to put together a cohesive self because he couldn't carry through the idealization. So he comes into analysis and he starts to idealize me because he's trying to start it up again. He's trying to take another run at it. He's going to try and do with me what failed with Dad. So he's going to put me up, and if I can tolerate it, and some analysts can't tolerate it because they spent 15 years in their own analysis struggling to push their grandiosity down. And now they've got someone telling them they're God, and it's making them very nervous because they're thinking that it's going to stimulate their old grandiosity. Well, that's a problem. One sec. So, if the analyst can tolerate being idealized, he can promote a slow and gradual optimal de-idealization, little bit by little bit over the years of the analysis, so that finally the patient can come to see that his analyst is not the biggest and the best, he's not Superman, he's not whatever, he's a human being. But this has happened the way it should have happened with his dad, slowly over time, and he's able to form a cohesive self as a result. So now these are two different patient populations. The patients that Kernberg is dealing with are borderline. The patients Kohut are dealing with they're people with narcissistic difficulties, self-esteem difficulties, but they're not really borderline. They're more like adolescents. Some of the best cases I've ever had the pleasure to treat have been guys like this. Graduate students who, for whatever reason, couldn't write their dissertations, and they came in, and we worked together sometimes just once a week for about 2 years, and they get their act together, and I didn't really have to do very much at all. I just had to be there, do my best to be understanding, and they got better because they weren't very ill to begin with. But they did need to work through a certain kind of idealization. They did need to, feel that they were under the aegis of an admired whatever, and that was enough, So those are, Kohut's idealizing patients are sort of easy to work with, whereas Kernberg's are much sicker people who really have a lot of malignant envy and hate. So that's another big difference between where they're talking at cross purposes, really, because it's two different patient populations. So you had a question a while ago.
Just I wanted to know what do you think the difference is, or if there is one, because you're talking about idealization and then your hypothetically your discomfort with being idealized.
Right.
Is that just another way of talking about a particular sort of transference and countertransference?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear about
Yeah, the analyst who can't stand being idealized is got a countertransference problem. And one reason he's got it is because he had to spend so much time taming his own grandiosity that being idealized feels to him like he's being invited to go crazy grandiose again. And he doesn't want to go there. So he's uncomfortable with this patient, right? Yeah. Yeah. Maybe, I think I've covered, there's so much more to say about all of this, but yes.
Completely off, but
Yeah.
could I ask, is there a very, very shortened version of the continually referred to science that shows that there is no such thing as primary narcissism?
Daniel Stern, The Interpersonal World of the Infant.
And what did that science look like?
Oh, tons of experiments of the sort that Piaget pioneered in cognitive theories of development. You give these little tests to babies, and if the baby can successfully pass the test, it means that the baby wouldn't be able to pass the test unless it had a cognitive function that would enable it to pass that test. And so they do a whole, I can't give you the exact ingenious, Beatrice Beebe, there's a whole lot of researchers who have done these ingenious, and video camera on the mother, video camera on the baby, watching frame by frame, watching the interaction between mother and infant, all of which tends to show very clearly that very, very young infants have so much more going on in their minds. See, for the early Freudians, the mind of the infant was William James, it was his phrase, buzzing, blooming confusion. That's how the infant mind was seen. And the Freudians used to laugh at the Kleinians, thinking that the Kleinians are attributing all of this stuff to the infant mind, but the infant mind is a buzzing, blooming confusion. Well, no, it's not. There's so much more. And we're discovering that the minds of primates are capable of far more than we ever thought that they were capable of. So it's not just infants, it's also primates, like bonobo monkeys are capable of theory of mind. That is, they're capable of understanding that another monkey has a wrong idea and is going to look for a missing object in the wrong place. And so it's tests like that that enable us to see that there's much more going on in the infant mind than anyone had thought. All of which confirmed Melanie Klein's conclusion way back in the 30s. I mean, she was probably the first one to be able to get that, not on the basis of any experimental evidence, just from her profound psychoanalytic intuition. Yeah. I think we're done. Or unless we, yeah, over there.
I just want to touch back to the pre-1950, post-1950 guilt versus shame.
Yes.
I'm guilty versus pragmatism.
Yeah. What a false dichotomy that is.
Yeah. I recently read an interesting book by Franco Berardi named Heroes, Mass Murder and Suicide, kind of talking about this enragement that's kind of suppressed and repressed and comes out in
Oh, I say good. They're getting onto that. Someone's onto that.
It's a very interesting book, just published last year. And he had a very interesting point, because we're talking about children, the parents, and the relations there. And he said, this is the first generation coming out now in the new millennia that is being taught to read and write by computers rather than their parents.
Oh.
This relation with this digital sphere, this relation with this digital parent or digital teacher. So,
Interesting.
like, just your opinion, your thoughts on the matter of what is that going to be like for analysis? What's that going to be like for psychotherapy with this new dimension now that is in constant play now?
Okay. Well, great, because now I'm able to end our discussion by confessing my castration and lack of omnipotence. I haven't got a clue. We'll wait and see. It's a very interesting question. I really don't know.